Anyone who has been involved in a new introduction, whether it be at work, a social setting, or a budding relationship, is likely familiar with icebreakers. Some of these types of games can be silly and feel awkward at surface level, but one in particular can go as deep as participants are willing to venture. 21 Questions is a classic and can be superficial or profound, work-friendly or spicy. Questions can be simple, like, where is your dream vacation? Others can probe further. For example, what are 5 words to describe you? For those brave enough, questions can get really deep and can enter the realm of personal philosophies, spiritual beliefs, personal strife, or triumph. One of the most contemplative, however, is, what are you willing to die for? Depending on who you ask, the answer will vary. My children, my country, my bodily autonomy, equality, our planet, universal peace. The list continues. However, for millions throughout history, the answer to that question came down to one thing that was valued above all else. The thing that was violently taken from them, for which they fought for until the very end. They didn't need to be asked because they showed their answer. They were willing to die for freedom. Welcome to National Park After Dark.
I'm excited for this episode because you've kind of hinted at me what it's about and told me a little bit about it. And I think this is going to be, I don't know anything about this, which also makes me excited to hear it.
Well, I was kind of like, as one does from time to time, I was looking at my list of U.S. national parks, kind of like the scratch off, tick off like the list. Obviously, we're all familiar with that. And I was just kind of mentally going through and being like, which parks have we covered, together on the show? And obviously there are quite a few of the big, main 60-something parks that we haven't done yet. And this one really jumped out at me. And when I first began researching it, I didn't really know what to expect. I've never personally been here to this area, let alone this park. And I was just thinking that there would be some sort, which I'm sure there are many other stories that have happened here that we could cover, but this one just screamed importance, and I really wanted to highlight it today. But before we get into it, just as a brief mention, this one is pretty heavy, and there are discussions and mentions of violence and some sexual abuse. So there is that to be forewarned about. Second thing is there are a lot of African, Dutch, and Spanish names throughout this story, and I'm going to do my darn best to pronunciate. Is that even a word?
Pronunciate.
Oh, honey. To pronounce them, but knowing me, I'll likely struggle, but I'm going to try. So don't come at me if I can't pronounce a Dutch word, okay? And then third is we have merch.
We sure do. We launched our merch. It came out last week. We're super stoked on it. There's so many cool things that's on there, and we're really proud and excited to bring it to you guys. So we'll link it in the show notes if you haven't seen it yet, if you haven't heard it on the podcast. We just want you to know it's there. It's up. We're very, very excited.
Yeah, so go check it out. All right. Well, without further ado, let's go somewhere tropical.
Ooh, okay.
Continuously topping the Caribbean's must-see lists, the U.S. Virgin Islands offer some of the most beautiful beaches, coral reefs, and marine wildlife watching in this part of the world. And as we know them today, the U.S. Virgin Islands are a group of Caribbean islands that consists of 3 main islands, St. Croix, St. John, and St. Thomas, along with 50 other smaller islands and cays, or low island clusters of reef, sand, or coral. In total, the combined land area of the islands is roughly twice the size of Washington, D.C., just to give some sort of perspective on that. The islands are precisely what you would imagine a tropical paradise to be. There's sparkling white sands, turquoise waters teeming with vibrant sea life, and lush tropical forests. On land, there are numerous species of reptiles and insects that scurry in the sand, and the forest containing over 800 species of vegetation. And it's also a birder's paradise. I know you're in your birding era.
I am in my birding era.
Yeah.
What birds are there?
There are nearly 200 species of birds on this cluster of islands. So bring your binoculars.
I'd bring my binoculars and my Merlin birding app, and I'd sit there and find them all.
However, under the sea is where a lot of the action takes place, with over 400 species of fish, dozens of whale and dolphin species, and nearly 50 coral species. A visit here without spending time underwater would be a pretty big mistake. And just as a side note, which is like, again, with the weird intersecting parallels and things that happen in life. Obviously, we're recording this a bit early. I know this comes out in July, but as of today, which is June 24th, I picked up the remains of my dog, Blue. And in the little package they gave me of just like grief support materials and things like that, they gave me this pamphlet. And I've heard of this concept, but not in this way. And I got this thing, and it's called Pet Memorial Reefs.
Oh.
Basically, they take your pet's cremated remains and they become a living underwater memorial reef.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah.
I've never heard of that.
Me either. And I was like, and it's from a company that we used to utilize when we were in the veterinary world. So I don't know if this is like a newish thing that they're offering, but there are different tiers that you can do, because I obviously looked into it. And for a couple of the tiers, they offer, you can get these like bronze statues or plaques put onto the actual like thing that goes down there that creates the structure.
And then the reefs like grow on top of it.
Yeah. And then you can put your dog's name, like in memory of Blue or, whoever on there. And then, it becomes a little place for coral to grow. And isn't that crazy?
Wow, that's so cool. What's the company?
It's sorry, let me look at it. Pet Reefs by Memorial Reefs International. And I actually went on really quick because before this recording, I tried to see where they were placing them. Like, obviously it's in a place where coral reefs are, but I didn't get any clear answer. So I'm gonna email them and just ask, because I have some plans for some of his remains, but I mean, depending on how much they need, like I think this would be a cool way to have him live on. So yeah.
It's a really cool concept.
Yeah.
Maybe one day you'll find yourself diving in that reef years from now when it's covered in coral.
That's the thing. No. Oh, God. Okay, moving on. So back to the Virgin Islands. Today, millions flock to the Virgin Islands who pride themselves in sustainable tourism to snorkel the reefs, explore tropical forests, wander through historic districts, lounge at beach clubs, and of course, visit the national park. Established in 1956 as the 29th site in the national park system, the park protects thousands of acres of terrestrial, shoreline, and marine habitat, from coral reefs, mountainous terrain, mangroves, seagrass beds, and tropical rainforest. This park was one of the first UNESCO biosphere reserves in the world, and it's actually only one of 30 that contains both marine and terrestrial ecosystems worldwide. So it's pretty cool.
Cool.
The park has expanded over the years, as many parks do, and as of today, they manage nearly 60% of the land area of St. John. So remember the 3 main islands. So nearly 60% of St. John is managed by the Park Service, along with more than 18,000 acres of offshore underwater habitat. All of this protected space offers numerous protections for both marine and terrestrial animals who rely on the space for breeding, nesting, feeding, and more. And the park system also preserves abundant and diverse cultural sites. There are hundreds of historic structures, shipwrecks, archaeological sites, and museums with collections dating back thousands of years. So despite its relatively small size, there is a ton going on here. And one park just wasn't enough. Over the years, Virgin Islands Coral Reef National Monument, Christiansted National Historic Site, Buck Island Reef National Monument, and Salt River Bay National Historic Park and Ecological Preserve have been established amongst the islands as well. So
wow.
It's not, the
Very
park
cool.
system is very prolific down here. Ferries and flights run from island to island to provide visitors with the opportunity to experience all that the U.S. Virgin Islands have to offer and gives people the perfect opportunity to explore the islands in their entirety, including the area's lengthy history. While the numerous beaches lined with lounge chairs, gear rental shops doling out paddle boards and snorkeling equipment, trendy restaurants serving up daiquiris, these are all wonderful. The Park Service does not shy away from highlighting and displaying the long, complex, not so pleasant, and frankly, pretty brutal history that took place on the same shores that we are sunning ourselves on. With human occupation dating back to 2000 BCE, there are hundreds of stories that are worthy of discussing from what is now this park, kind of like I mentioned in the beginning. But I decided on one of the most pivotal and poignant of them all. Today, we will be talking about the 1733 Akwamu Insurrection. So before we get into the story, I'm going to need to set the scene a bit because the islands as we know them today, and as I just described, are a far departure from what they were for most of history. As I mentioned, human presence has been recorded here for thousands of years, despite Christopher Columbus getting credit for discovering these islands in 1493 after landing on the island of St. Croix. By the time he had first arrived, the Taino culture was already thriving. They had their own advanced political organization, they had a spoken language, elaborate religious life, and more. Like, you can't say you discovered something when this culture has
people are living there.
That's right. It's like, excuse me, what?
It's like there's literally people here you didn't discover it.
Yeah. As we are aware, throughout most of the world, the arrival of Europeans marked the end of indigenous life as many knew it, and this case is unfortunately no different. Following European arrival, the indigenous population was completely decimated through disease, warfare, and forced enslavement. If I were to get into the details of all the arrivals, exchanges, and falls of power on this cluster of islands, we would be here literally all day. I tried to understand it, and I got a little bit I have a little bit of an understanding, but it would just be too much for here. So just know that in the centuries that followed Christopher Columbus's arrival, the islands were ruled by the English, Dutch, Spanish, Knights of Malta, and the Danes before the U.S. ever got involved.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, which by the way, wasn't until 1917 when they first started to enter the picture. So there's been
kind
a lot.
Of recent. I mean, it's only a little over 100 years ago.
Yeah. So since, the end of the 1400s when Columbus got there up until 1917, there was a lot of rises and falls of power.
So it was like 600 years of
back and forth and up and down. And yeah.
Yeah.
As a result, though, of all of that changing of hands and lots of different influence of different cultures, present-day Virgin Islands culture is rich and unique, and it has a blend of West African, Danish, Spanish, Irish, and German heritage. So there's a lot going on here. It's really culturally diverse and rich.
Investing your money can be really intimidating, especially if you don't know where to start. I was never taught how to invest my money. And let's be real, I was barely taught how to even budget my money, let alone invest it. Plus, I always thought that investing was something that people with a lot of money did. But that's simply not true. Today's episode is sponsored by Acorns. Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing for your future. You don't need a lot of money or expertise to invest with Acorns. In fact, you can get started with just your spare change. Acorns recommends an expert-built portfolio that fits you and your money goals, then automatically invests your money for you. I really love how easy Acorns makes it to invest. When I first started using it, I had almost no money to spare. But Acorns works great because they allow you to round up to the next dollar when you buy something and use that spare change to invest. For example, if you spend $1.75 on a pack of gum, they'll take the 25 cents to round up to the next dollar and invest that money for you. So it's change you don't miss or notice is
is gone, but you're able to invest it. Head to acorns.com/NPAD or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. Client testimonial compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors, LLC, an SEC registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/NPAD.
In the early 1600s, as I just alluded to, many countries took a big interest in the Caribbean. Throughout the 17th and into the 18th century, several colonies inhabited the islands and battled it out or bartered for control of St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John. By the late 1600s, the Danish gained control of all three and brought them together under what was then called the Danish West Indies. Along with opening the door to other foreign settlers and creating a melting pot, Columbus, when he arrived, also brought something that changed everything here, and that was sugarcane. And that was the primary reason that the Danes wanted control of the islands for the purpose of establishing plantations where they could cultivate tropical products and crops. These included cotton, indigo, coffee, and various other goods that couldn't be grown well in other environments, especially in colder environments, but none of those products were as lucrative as sugar. Sugar, which again, who would have thought sugar has—
I love sugar.
A very—
I'm a big fan.
Yeah, I'm sure there are podcasts out there entirely dedicated to the history of sugar because it is also very lengthy. And there are varying information out there as far as when sugar first appeared in Europe. Actually 5 different sources said 5 different things. But the biggest consensus I got out of everything was around the 11th century where it kind of first came onto the scene. But it really started to take off in the 16th century, so the 1500s. And as a result of that, it's kind of more common and widespread, and everyone was going wild for it. You know, the demand for this fancy exotic product just skyrocketed. I mean,
I get it. You're eating bread and unflavored meats, and then suddenly someone presents sugar to you.
And for those people who are like, I'm not a big sugar fan, sugar is in probably 90% of things that you eat, and you would have no idea, but it's in the ingredients. So, at this time, it's kind of this new revolutionary thing that no one had, or it wasn't readily accessible. So the demand, totally went up the roof. And as a result, the price reflected that. So the price was also pretty high at this time for sugar. So this relatively new industry created an opportunity to accumulate enormous wealth and power. In the 1600s, nearly every European country was desperate for control of a tropical colony to establish sugarcane plantations because the demand was so high. There was such an opportunity to make a ton of money. And to compare to a present day business, it is said that a comparable business to the sugar trade during this period of time in the colonial times is comparable to present day drug trafficking. That's how—
Wow.
Yeah.
Sugar was a drug.
Yeah.
Sugar is my drug.
When the Danish finally gained control of the pirates occupying the islands, because also, I forgot to mention, there were pirates as well that were in the mix for control.
Fun.
So when they finally
time.
got them out of the way and colonized the islands for themselves, the king formed the Danish West India Company in 1671. And it was a business that was backed by the state that would manage the Danish settlement and its various plantations on the island. It got off to a pretty rough start. So basically what happened is the king establishes this company and says, okay, I'm going to send this company out to the islands to manage the sugar production and other crops, but mainly for the sugarcane. And he sent 190 people on board a ship, and that ship sailed to the islands from Denmark. During its voyage, dozens died or escaped during the journey, and even more died within a year, leaving less than 30 people in the colony. They began plans for cultivating various goods, but they weren't going to do the hard work themselves. Upon arrival, it was clear that the indigenous inhabitants had been wiped out, and their absence posed a problem. So originally, their plan was, all right, 190 of you are going to go to these islands and start establishing plantations and get these crops going. All said and done, 30 arrive to these islands to get this going. And at first, obviously that's a big blow to the original group, but their plan was to rely on the indigenous people to to enslave the indigenous peoples of the island to get their plantations going. But when they arrived and realized that most of the indigenous community had already been wiped out, they're like, what? Now what?
We can't do this ourselves.
Absolutely not. Yeah. So they were like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. So the Danish government encouraged young Danes to emigrate to St. Thomas to work the plantations. They're like, okay, well, I guess we'll advertise in our own country, like, look at these islands, like, it's beautiful, work, and, come on down. But their pleas were met with a less than enthusiastic response. The inadequate manpower and frequent pirate raids made life and plantation viability difficult. Prisoners, then, were brought to St. Thomas to work on the plantations as indentured servants from Denmark. So they're trying everything here. And the deal was that they would work for 6 years and then receive their freedom. These prisoners, that was how they kind of advertised this.
That's not a bad deal if you're in prison for longer than 6 years.
For life or something like that, yeah. However, on paper, that may sound great. However, very few survived the 6 years because they were worked so hard and treated so poorly. So a lot of them died before their 6 years was complete. Their living and working conditions were absolutely horrendous, and their social position, which at that time was considered of the lowest order, opened them up to pretty severe punishment. It wasn't long until word of the conditions got back to Denmark, and prisoners heard of all of this, and they viewed being shipped to the Caribbean as a death sentence. So because of that, mutinies and resistance led the Danes to shift focus once again because they could not get people to go there.
Yeah, I'm sure they hear that and they're like, never. What sounded nice is we're not even going to survive.
Yeah, I'll stay in my cell.
To get our freedom.
I'll stay in my cell.
Yeah, especially if you're there for like 10 years, 15 years. It's like, I'm good.
Right.
I have a life to make it out too.
So as a result, they began importing enslaved people from Danish trading posts on the west coast of the African continent, primarily in the present-day country of Ghana. And we have discussed the slave trade before at length in a couple different episodes, but just off the top of my head, I know that I covered an episode, I think it was episode 65. That seems a little early, but you could double check me, but
65.
I think it's 65. It was the one focusing on the Guerrero. I know I have to roll my R's, but I can't do that.
I can't either.
It was the one in Biscayne National Park. I think it was a bonus story.
That was a long time ago. Maybe 65 sounds right.
Yeah, it was a bonus story originally, and then we released it when Ian passed away, just to give me a kind of a week of a breather. So I think So that may be right. But yeah, so anyways, we really went into it, I know for a fact, in that one. But of course, it bears repeating. I'm not going to go into as lengthy of detail, but because it's pertinent to the story, and also because it's an important reminder of just how brutal this chapter in history was, and to breeze over it feels like a little bit of an oversight. So the institution of slavery that rose in the colonization of the Americas was a business. It was motivated by profit and greed and lacked significantly in any sort of morality. Enslaved captives were brought to European forts where buyers would purchase humans using a barter system or money. The enslaved were then chained and stored in warehouses until ships arrived, which would transport captives into cramped quarters. The conditions in the confined spaces so small that the possibility of standing or even sitting at times was pretty much non-existent, and obviously the conditions beyond that were atrocious. And due to those conditions, including no proper ventilation or sanitary facilities, disease, starvation, and dehydration also ran rampant. Women were raped. Thousands lost their lives en route to their destinations due to these factors, or by claiming their own lives prior to arrival. And then upon arrival, enslaved people were sold at public auction and marched to plantations where the suffering continued, and in many cases grew worse. And as I mentioned, the Danish entered the slave trade on the Guinea coast in present-day Ghana, and they worked alongside the Akara tribe, who acted as a middleman in the exchange of enslaved people, as well as different goods such as gold, ivory, and other manufactured items like firearms and rum. So this tribe, the Akara, at the time controlled all the transportation and travel from the interior of the continent to the coast, where the Danish forts were. They also controlled many neighboring tribes, including the Akwamu, forcing them to pay their tribe tributes, taking members of their tribe and other tribes and enslaving them for themselves. However, as time went on, the Akwamu started to rise to power and the roles kind of reversed a bit. So the Akwamu were extraordinarily powerful and had excellent warriors amongst their tribe, and they overthrew their oppressors, which were the Akara tribe, through a series of violent military campaigns, ultimately killing and enslaving thousands. So it was like a role reversal over a few years there. And they went on to rise above all other tribes in the area, and they took control of the region. So to say the least, their rough-handed ruling didn't gain them much love or support by other tribes in the area. So when the Akwamu king died in 1725, and there was some debate within the Akwamu tribe on who was going to rise to power next. There was a lot of different, again, kind of glazing over this part. Just
a lot of history
here. But essentially, while this debate was going on, it kind of fractured that rigidity and that cohesive ruling that the other tribes were kind of bowing down to. And they took this opportunity as a moment of weakness to attack the Akwamu nation. 5 years later, the Akwamu were conquered, their capital was destroyed, and their new king, which was eventually elected and rose to power, was beheaded. And that moment in time really scattered the Akwamu nation and resulted in thousands of the Akwamus being sold to the Danish in the early 1730s, many of whom were forced onto ships headed straight for St. John. By 1733, there were roughly 200 European settlers and more than 1,000 enslaved people, the majority of which were Akwamu, working on 109 plantations on the island of St. John. So this is where our story is now taking place.
Gotcha. That's a lot of enslaved people to not enslaved people.
The ratio is...
Yeah, the ratio is very...
will come into play.
Here.
It will come into play.
Yeah.
So the enslaved lived and worked under brutal conditions, working long hours and, of course, very hard labor. Additionally, they were required to provide... This is crazy. I mean, the whole thing. We don't have to say it. We've talked about it, how insane the history of slavery is.
Yeah.
Especially in colonial America. But particularly here, they were required to provide their own food. So essentially in their quote-unquote spare time, so let's imagine whenever that would be, in their spare time, they were to labor in fields of small plots of land that were kind of like sequestered aside for their own use. And those were called provision grounds. And on those provision grounds, they were required to grow and harvest, and that's how they would get their food. So
they work them and don't feed them.
You're like, okay, so you can work for 20 hours a day, and on your off time, grow your own food as well.
Figure out how to feed yourself.
Yeah.
Summertime is in full swing, and when I think of summer smells, I think of sunscreen, mountain air, barbecues, and unfortunately, body odor. It's the most active time of year, and we're getting after the outdoors, so unfortunately, we get a little stinky, but it doesn't have to be that way this summer. Thanks to Lumi Whole Body Deodorant, BO will no longer be something that I'm worried about on my adventures. Their pH-optimized formula is clinically proven to block odor all day, and it's not just for underarms, it's for everywhere we get odor. Pits, privates, feet, underboob, you name it. Lumi is clinically proven to block odor all day and control odor for up to 72 hours. I love Lumi because when it comes to deodorants, it can be hard to find safe ingredients, but Lumi is baking soda free and paraben free. Plus, they have some really great scents. Clean tangerine being my favorite, but they also have lavender sage, which is great, or toasted coconut. Lumi's starter pack is perfect for new customers. It comes with a solid stick deodorant, cream tube deodorant, 2 free products of your choice, like mini body wash and deodorant wipes, and free shipping. As a special offer for our listeners, new customers get 15% off all Lumi products with our exclusive code. And if you combine the 15% off with the already discounted starter pack, that equals over 40% off their starter pack. Use code NPAD for 15% off your first purchase at lumideodorant.com. That's code NPAD at LUMEDEODORANT.com. DORANT.com.
The island experienced prolonged droughts in the years preceding this date of the story, which is 1733, and in 1733 itself. And that's important because 1733 brought not only another drought, but a severe hurricane and a plague of insects. So all of these combined events, the kind of back-to-back droughts, all these insects that are devastating the crops and bad weather, it devastated their provision plots, leaving those who relied on the food on those plots facing starvation because nearly all of their crops faced total failure.
Oh, that's awful.
So it's putting them in a really, an even worse position than they were already in. And these events led to a large number of enslaved St. Johnians to run from and abandon their plantations. Much of the island, and it's hard to, because if you look at pictures now, and especially if you've been there, if you look up St. John, like it's lush, like tropical,
beautiful,
forests.
tropical. I've never been, but I've definitely seen photos.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the photos not of the beach, like you see in the background a lot of lush vegetation and forests. But at this time in the 1730s, or by the 1730s, I should say, much of the island was clear cut to make way for these plantations. So there wasn't a ton of places to go, but some of the areas of the thick forest did remain. And it was there that the enslaved peoples who decided to abandon their plantations hid and attempted to live off the land on their own. And the Danish deemed this maroonage. And in response, the governor of the islands enacted what was called the 1733 Slave Code in May of that year. And the code, which essentially expressed the philosophy that the enslaved were property of plantation owners, and this property, these people, had zero rights. And the code also included harsh penalties for acts of defiance against the Danish. And again, the code is very lengthy and filled with many words, too many words to just let's just get to the point.
Yeah.
So to condense it down a bit, just to give an example and give some context here, if an enslaved person committed grand larceny, they were to be pinched 3 times with red-hot tongs and hanged. In the case of an attempted runaway or conspiracy to run away, leg amputation, branding, or if their master forgave them, their punishment was 150 lashes and the cutting off of an ear. And these were all very standard. Like this was in the code, like written in the code.
That's messed up.
If an enslaved person was to come into contact with a European, they were to have to step aside, stand still, and be subservient. And if they did not abide by these guidelines, or if their behavior was not deemed good enough by said European, they'd be beaten for that.
Nice.
Even a menacing gesture, which is a direct quote, I don't know, like that's so open to interpretation. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Or any sort of verbal insult was grounds for torture and hanging. Any dancing, tribal customs, including traditional funerary rituals and rites, were punishable by whipping. The code, which was written with the intention of controlling the enslaved through fear tactics, only intensified the already deep motivation for revolt. And seeing no other alternative, that is exactly what happened. So shortly after the announcement of the code, a group of enslaved Akwamu began working on a plan to take down their enslavers and take control of the island, as well as the estates and the plantations on it. However, their aim was not escape. It was to make St. John an Akwamu-ruled state, to take control of the island, the people, both Danish and other enslaved peoples from other tribal nations in Africa, and use the plantations for their own benefit. So I think that's such a departure from other stories that we've read and shared here, because the goal was always to run away. Like, we don't want to be involved anymore. And I think it's an interesting mixture because, number one, this is an island. Where are you going to escape to? Like, without adequate...
Yeah, you have to stay.
Transportation.
Essentially.
Unless you took over a ship or a crew or...
But then you still have to go somewhere where you're accepted.
Where is that going to be anywhere near, the islands without a long voyage? So there's that obviously at play.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting because it's so telling of, the at home, like the Akwamu Nation ruled other tribal nations in Africa. So it's like they wanted to kind of replicate that.
Have that again.
Yeah, have that again. So essentially, their aim was to recreate and reinstitute their home nation's former reign and create the first free African state in the Americas. So that was their goal going into this. And 4 people emerged as the rebellion's leaders. There was King Clays, King Juni, King Kanta, and Brefu. King Clays, King Juni, and King Kanta had been prominent members of their nation before they were abducted from Africa, and their social status warranted a lot of respect from the enslaved community on the island. People knew who they were. They were nobles, so the enslaved community plotted during secret meetings and established a communication network throughout the island, and word of the rebellion spread very quickly throughout the enslaved community on the island, and instructions were given about the plan, the goal, what everyone, how it's going to go down. But most importantly, their instructions were to listen for cannon shots, and once you hear them, you kill every European you can find.
Damn.
It's going to go down. I'm telling you right now.
Damn, this is about to get bloody and messy. No survivors.
Well, you'll see. It's so... It's crazy because it's not crazy. That's a bad word. But it's just so interesting because the juxtaposition of what we know the Virgin Islands to be now and what is about what I'm about to tell you. It's just, it's crazy so to different. Overlay the two. And like I kind of mentioned, we'll get to it in detail further at the end, but the Park Service does highlight the obviously, I mean, it's a huge chunk of the island's history is slavery and what happened. So,
I mean, and if these people are about to go in and kill everybody, I'm sure that left a major mark on the history there as well. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you can't blame them.
No.
They've all been enslaved. They're being killed. They don't have food. They're being overworked. They're not paid. They're in a foreign country.
Yeah, you're gonna insult me. I'll take your leg or I'll hang you.
Yeah,
it's just
it's the punishments don't fit the crime.
Yeah,
and you're already holding these people against their will.
Yep.
Hair and skincare should work, and it should be good for the planet. I've never been more confident with my natural hair texture or the condition of my skin until I started using my Prose custom hair and skin routine. And the cherry on top, Prose is a certified B Corp, cruelty-free, and the first and only carbon neutral custom beauty brand. Since I started using Prose, my hair is healthier and shinier than it's ever been, and my skin is the clearest and smoothest I've ever seen it. Prose is made completely custom to you and what you need. With their in-depth consultation and made-to-order model, they create a formula that is unique to you. I struggle with a dry scalp and hair, so Prose customized my hair conditioner and gave me a custom scalp treatment to use that has worked wonders for me. They even have a review and refine tool which learns from my feedback and adjusts my formula to keep up with the seasons and changes in my life. Prose is so confident that you'll bring out your best hair and skin that they're offering an exclusive trial offer of 50% off your first subscription order at prose.com/NPAD. So you get your free consultation, then 50% off at prose.com/NPAD. That's prose.com/NPAD.
So it's about to all unfold here in the early morning hours of November 23rd of 1733. And remember, the slave code or whatever went into effect in May. So since that was like the last straw, essentially.
Gotcha.
So in the months between May and November is kind of when this plan started to really gain legs and take form. So on the 23rd, in the early morning hours, a group of enslaved people carried bundles of wood into the fort on Coral Bay. What looked like a simple delivery was in fact the violent beginning of their plan. Hidden in the wood piles were knives, and I'm going to say in many, many of these sources, including on the National Park Service site, they refer to the enslaved peoples as the rebels because they're rebelling against the system or whatever.
Rebels, they're fighting for their freedom.
So the rebels.
Are rebels usually referring to like someone who's doing something wrong against?
Right.
Yeah, like bad. Like they're just trying to be alive and treated like actual people.
Yeah. So I just wanted to clarify that. Like, I don't want that connotation to be taken for when I'm trying to explain the story.
It's just how they've been referred to in history.
Yes, of course.
Gotcha.
Yep. So in the wood piles, there's the knives, which the rebels used to kill the still sleepy soldiers who were guarding the fort because it's very early in the morning. People are just waking up. So they kill the soldiers. And it also bears mentioning that at the time, there were only 6 soldiers total on the island. Just, again, here's the ratio starting to come into play.
I would not want to be one of those soldiers, like, creating these rules. It's like, have you counted how many there are of us? Yeah, maybe we have weapons, but what's that going to do against 1,000 people to 6?
And it does also, it's important to mention that a lot of these rules and regulations and all that are kind of coming from the higher ups who aren't really on the island themselves. You know what I mean? So there's a mixture here of, I'm sure, you know, when that kind of came down, it's like, okay, there's all these rules and regulations and all these harsh punishments, and there's 6 soldiers and some plantation owners, you know?
Yeah.
So anyway, after taking the fort, the rebels raised the flag and fired 3 cannon shots, which was the signal to the others that everyone else was waiting for. One of the fort soldiers was able to hide and ran away when he saw the opportunity, and he managed to secure a small boat and made his way to neighboring St. Thomas, where he alerted Danish officials of what just happened. But chaos was already well underway, and the fort had fallen. Shortly before the cannon shots were fired, Brefu, because remember I said there was the 3 kings and then Brefu as kind of like the leaders of this plan, Brefu and an enslaved man named Christian were waiting quietly outside a small stone house belonging to the family of plantation owners, the Croyers. Once they heard the signal, Brefu entered the house and killed the entire family, raided the home for ammunition and weapons before moving on to the Van Steele family home, where 3 of the plantation owners' families were also killed. King Juni, King Kanta, and King Clays each split into groups and systematically made their way through Coral Bay, slaughtering men, women, and children as they moved through the island. Rebel numbers rose as they went from plantation to plantation, and the killing continued. Some Europeans were spared, most notably a doctor whose name is Cornelius Boger. He was given a pass due to the care that he had provided to the enslaved community because he was the island's doctor. His 2 sons were also spared. However, they were made into servants for the new rebel leaders. It's like, you can live.
You're like, well, you can live, but roles are reversed now.
Yep. So you work for us now. I'm the captain now.
I'm the captain now. Yeah. Fair.
Yep. Fair. Again, fair. Other Europeans were able to narrowly escape to other islands after hearing of the plans from loyal, quote unquote, loyal servants. So once kind of the chaos was unfolding and the cat was kind of out of the bag, some of the enslaved peoples that worked for some plantation owners told them what was happening, and they were able to escape. In one case, for the Jansen family, their enslaved workers actually kept the rebels at bay while they retreated to safety at the Durlow plantation, which had become a sort of stronghold for the European settlers during this uprising. So they kind of made that plantation into the headquarters, safe space. I don't know. They kind of fortified it, and that's kind of where they all went during the uprising. The Akwamu killed or took control over any enslaved person who resisted or did not wish to participate in the rebellion. It's like you're with us or you're not with us at all. Yeah, essentially. Yeah. They looted any home that they could after killing the inhabitants of the home before setting their sights on the Durlow plantation, where many of the settlers who had not been able to escape by boat had then retreated. As the Akwamu approached, the settlers who had fortified the plantation fought back with musket fire and cannons, but the Akwamu fought back repeatedly and viciously. Despite nearly capturing the plantation several times and setting fire to the munition pile at that plantation, the settlers held their ground. Word traveled to the nearby islands, and dozens of men were stationed on watch every night in case of a surprise attack, because they didn't know if it was just going to be restricted just to St. John. They didn't know if there were plans to come to
go
the
to
other
places.
Islands. Right.
Yeah. I mean, they're not that far.
Right. Pleas from the Danish on St. John for aid was sent to St. Thomas. The governor sent a small party of soldiers consisting of other enslaved Africans that were enslaved on that island. The army was well armed, and they were able to recapture the fort and scatter the rebels. So the original fort that had fallen, they managed to capture that and kind of scatter out a lot of the people throughout the island. And the rebels scattered throughout the forests and the bush of the island. They survived off the land and by looting abandoned plantations and farms. They held their ground, fighting guerrilla style before disappearing back into the bush. And this continued for over 2 months before any additional support arrived by way of a British ship carrying 60 soldiers.
60?
60.
And how many people are fighting on the other side?
The original numbers was 1,000 enslaved people to, what did I say, 300? 200, excuse me. 200 European settlers, more than 1,000 enslaved people this year in 1733.
And now they sent 60 soldiers for still around 1,000 people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there were some people who lost their lives.
Fatalities. And
yeah,
stuff,
fatalities.
Still, there's hundreds more than 60.
But I have a feeling that they probably really underestimated what was happening.
Yeah.
So that...
Well, if you think about it, part of why they were enslaving these people is because they thought very little of them.
Correct.
So they probably didn't think the uprising that was happening was as organized and successful as it was being.
Correct, yeah. So that support, unsurprisingly, didn't last very long. The rebels staged an ambush as soon as that ship was arriving and killed and wounded several of those soldiers before the captain decided to retreat. So he's like, let's turn it right back around and get out of here.
There's not enough of us. We're out of here.
He read the room. The Danes were more than desperate at this point. None of the support that they had enlisted made even a dent in the insurrection. In February, a St. Kitts-based privateer named John Maddox was hired by Danish officials. And remember, okay, this began in November. We're now in February. So they're getting desperate here. They're like, please help.
They're like, this needs to end. It's been a long time.
It's been months.
And if you think about it, like, I think part of why why it's taking so long is they already had these people living off the land and surviving on their own. So now it's like, we're good. We're just like fighting you guys. We can live off the land. There's not a lot of you.
We know our way around. We now know this place.
We've been working our asses off for months. Like, we're fit and we're good.
They just so underestimated the Akwamu Nation because of course there are other people from different tribes and nations that are in this mix, but it's called the Akwamu Insurrection for a reason. And they were they knew what they were doing. I mean, they had a lot of control in their homeland, like these are not people to mess with, and they're showing it now.
I have always struggled to find what to have in the morning for breakfast, but now I have been loving eating IQ bars, plant protein bars, as a quick, diet-friendly, brain-boosting breakfast. Power up your life with superior brain and body nutrition products from IQ Bar. Their plant protein bars are the perfect low-carb, grab-and-go breakfast. Their IQ Mix zero-sugar hydration drinks replenishes electrolytes lightning fast, and their IQ Joe mushroom coffees are packed with magnesium and lion's mane's adaptogens to keep you focused all day long. They have over 10,000 five-star reviews and counting. Start each day right with IQ Bar's brain and body boosting bars, hydration mixes, and mushroom coffees. Their ultimate sampler pack includes all three. Get 7 IQ Bar flavors, 4 IQ Mix flavors, and 4 IQ Joe flavors. And today, our listeners get an exclusive offer of 20% off plus free shipping. Just text PARK to 64,000. The Ultimate Sampler Pack is a great way to try all IQ Bar products and flavors. All IQ Bar products are entirely free from gluten, dairy, soy, GMOs, and artificial sweeteners. Whether you're out on the trails or running errands, IQ Bar empowers doers with superior brain and body nutrition. Their plant protein bars are packed with high-quality ingredients to keep you physically and mentally fit. IQ Bars are vegan, gluten-free, and low in sugar and carbs, and all of their flavors, chocolate sea salt, peanut butter chip, my favorite, wild blueberry, and more, is absolutely delicious. Refuel smarter with IQ Bar's Ultimate Sampler Pack. That's 7 IQ Bars, 4 IQ Mix Sticks, and 4 IQ Joe Sticks. And now our special podcast listeners get 20% off all IQ Bar products, plus get free shipping. To get your 20% off, just text PARK to 64,000. Get your discount, text PARK to 64,000. That's PARK to 64,000. Message and data rates may apply. See terms for details.
So back to the privateer, John Maddox. He was hired for help. And the deal was that he and his men could capture as many, or were encouraged to capture as many of the enslaved rebels as possible. And he could keep all of them for his own use.
Interesting.
Except for the 10 most dangerous rebels or most violent, which would then be turned over to Danish authorities for punishment.
Which we all know what that looks like for the smallest things. So.
Right. So imagine what it would be for this. So again, that did not pan out because on the very first interaction that John Maddox and his crew had with the rebels, nearly 10 of his men were dead or wounded immediately, like right off the bat. And he retreated. And he gave up his deal. He's like, I don't want it.
Like, I don't need any of them, please. Like,
I don't want anything to do with this.
I don't know what's going on here, but I'm not interested.
Like, we're not they just, again, the underestimation just keeps coming back. And it wasn't until April that the Danish struck a deal that would turn the tides of the rebellion. They struck a deal with the French, who at the time were in desperate need of money. On April 23rd, the French arrived with 400 soldiers, many of which specialized in so-called maroon hunting, or, in other words, the tracking, capturing, and killing of runaway enslaved people. A relentless pursuit of the rebels ensued as they pushed them to the east side of St. John. Many were captured or killed in this process, but the remaining rebels who refused to surrender climbed up a rocky cliffside overlooking Browns Bay. Knowing that defeat was imminent, together they jumped, completing a group suicide.
Wow.
24 bodies were found at the base of the cliff, and among them was Brefu, who, to the shock of the Danish, was a woman.
Damn. That's cool.
Isn't that cool?
That's cool. Good for her.
Yeah. Like there was a big thing about that. Like, who would have thought a woman
Oh my God,
was a leader, one of the leaders of this rebellion?
And the successful rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
How could a woman's brain manage that?
And she killed a lot of people because remember, she entered a lot of plantation, killed women, children, and, she was just like, this is for my people. And yeah. So the French troops continued this relentless pursuit throughout the island, locating and destroying rebel encampments that were kind of scattered throughout the remaining forests, capturing and killing people as they went. Suicide continued, and some enslaved people surrendered. Despite surrender, many were not spared. And I'm going to read an excerpt from a document found in the French National Archives written by one of the French commanders, which describes and gives an accurate picture of the horror that even those who surrendered faced. And I'm pretty much going to read it word for word. So as for the warnings, A, number one, it's brutal, and B, the language is clearly, you can tell it was written in 1734 by a French commander. It's completely not acceptable today, but it's very brief as far as that part. So, quote, on Sunday, May 16th, 1734, 6 Negroes and 2 Negro women surrendered at the appeal of their master who spared their lives. I ordered him to bring them to me, since they were identified as rebels. I had them put into chains. 3 of them were burned at the stake on 3 different plantations of St. John. I had previously informed the governor while passing through St. Thomas that should I catch a few of the rebels, I would put most of them to death and send him the rest so that he could make an example of them. The following day, I informed him of their capture. He sent a judge who passed sentence for the sake of formality. I sent him the 3 other rebels along with the 2 women and requested that he not have them executed until I be present. 1 was burned to death slowly, another was sawed in half, and the 3rd was impaled. The 2 Negro women had their hands and heads cut off after all 5 had been tortured with hot pincers throughout the town. End quote.
That is horrific and horrible and disgusting. And the fact that the way that is written, it sounds like he was almost bragging about it.
100%. And he was like, I requested that nothing happened to them until I could personally be there.
Like, I wanted to be there for that. It just shows how much they didn't view these people as humans and how it's just, it's disgusting.
And it was, you know, in their view, they were making an example out of them, out of the rebels. And it's just...
It's like, this is why they rebelled, because this is the way that you treat them. Like, it's just awful.
So that's just kind of to give a glimpse into how horrific this was, you know? Mm-hmm. The French successfully reclaimed the island for the Danish and left. However, they were unaware at the time of their departure that there was a very small group of rebels that were still hiding in the bush. Eventually, a deal was struck between the leader of that small group, named Prince, and the settlers through a middleman, in which essentially they would be forgiven if they came back to work. Prince and 14 others surrendered, but as we all know, promises are never kept. And sadly, Prince was shot and killed, and his head was cut off as a trophy. His followers, the other 14 individuals, 4 of them died in jail on St. Thomas, 6 were tortured to death, and 4 were sent to St. Croix to be worked to death. Yeah. So.
Wow. That's horrific.
By the time it was all over in May of 1734, there was steep losses on both sides. 44 plantations were damaged, approximately 300 enslaved people were dead, and 3/4 of the European settlers were killed. The rebellion lasted 6 months and served as one of the earliest and longest-lasting revolts of enslaved people in North America. It also inspired other revolts that would take place later, including on St. Croix, in Jamaica, Guyana, and in Haiti. Emancipation was won in the Danish West Indies in July of 1848, and by 1867, all sugar plantations were destroyed or shut down permanently. Shortly after, most of St. John fell into disuse, and the forest began to start reclaiming the land and the abandoned structures. Industry lingered here and there, mainly cattle farming and some bay oil production, until 1917, when the islands were purchased by the U.S. The United States was interested in the islands since the 1860s, actually, but negotiations took over 50 years before a deal was finally made. A formal transfer was made in March of 1917 when the islands were bought from the Danish for $25 million in gold coin. It was then that the name also changed from the Danish West Indies to the Virgin Islands of the United States. From there, tourism kicks up in the 1930s, and in the 1950s, the Rockefellers came onto the scene. Considered one of the wealthiest families to have ever existed in human history, they were also one of the first major philanthropists in this country. Lawrence Rockefeller owned an estate on St. John where he had constructed an ecologically friendly commercial resort, but seeking to expand environmental preservation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund supported the expansion of the park, of the national park. So 5 years after the park first opened, the Rockefeller family donated the resort and surrounding area, which in turn doubled the size of the national park that we have today.
Wow, cool.
And they also have done similar preservation donations in Jackson Hole, of all places.
Wow. They're also, the Rockefellers there's a national park for them in Vermont.
Oh, look at that.
It's the Marsh Billings National Park, and it talks a lot about their agricultural advances and how they spread sustainable farming across the country and how it began in Vermont.
Look at that. I don't know too much about the Rockefellers, do you?
No, not really.
Yeah, me either. So I can't comment further because I don't know what they're all about other than this nice, shiny, good part of them. But they are obviously one of the most well-known families in history, period.
Yeah, them and the Carnegies are like the big ones.
Do you remember that show? God, I think it was on the History Channel, and I think it was called The Men Who Built America or something like that. Do you remember that? And it highlighted like a different powerful family in American history, and the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and there was like every episode was a different family.
No, I don't remember. I don't know if I've ever seen that.
Okay, well, I'll have to look it up after because it was really interesting, but it was many years ago. Anyway, so back to the islands. So it's up for debate, and it remains unclear whether Brefu was of royal society in the Akwamu Nation like the others were, because I think partially because she was a woman. A lot sometimes that kind of gets lost to history. But of course, we know the other leaders that the other three leaders were. But regardless, her leadership in the rebellion gained her the posthumous title of Queen of St. John. There have been other documented cases of women playing roles in events such as the 1733 insurrection, but largely their stories remain invisible and lost to history due to who recorded history, of course.
Yep.
In fact, all we know today of Brefu is thanks to the verbal testimony in the aftermath of the rebellion. So it's only from word of mouth from the survivors of the rebellion that we know the role that she played.
And that she existed.
And that she existed at all. Today in Cruz Bay and in other areas of St. John, she is celebrated at Independence Day festivals and parades as the Queen of St. John.
Cool.
As I mentioned briefly at the beginning of the episode, the park preserves a diverse number of cultural sites, many of which are tied to this event and this period in history. Ruins of many of the plantations that existed on the island during sugar production are located within the park, two of which, Reef Bay Sugar Factory and Annaberg Plantation, are very popular with visitors. There are ranger-guided hikes that also provide a history of sugar production and the enslavement of Africans on the island, as well as an annual festival at the Annenberg Sugar Plantation ruins during Black History Month, which focuses on cultural traditions and includes the history of sugar production. There's arts and crafts, there's storytelling and music. However, the events of the 1733 insurrection were never commemorated with any sort of physical marker or memorial or information board or anything.
Oh.
Until 2022, when legislation was introduced to install a memorial plaque to memorialize the uprising at the peak of Ram's Head, which is the site of that ritualistic group suicide that I talked about.
Wow. So 2 years ago at this when we're recording this, 2 years ago, it was finally memorialized.
Well, it was first even brought up. Like, hey, we should do something.
Hey, this is an important part of history. Maybe we should.
Especially
we have plaques for everything else.
Yeah, it took place in the park.
Yeah.
On one of the hikes that we advertise. We should do something about that.
Yeah.
And there's a man, his name is Ahmad Touré. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that incorrectly, but he's the chief of interpretation at Virgin Islands National Park. And he researched the rebellion extensively and spoke with various historians to get everything correct for the proposed signs language. He wanted to make sure everything was T's were crossed, the I's were dotted. And the hike to the lookout at the top of Ram's Head isn't a super popular hike with every visitor because it has a little bit of a rough climb. So along with the commemorative plaque that they wanted to put at the summit of that hike, he worked to install other informational signage about the event around the park in other locations so that more people could learn about it and you didn't just have to see it if you happen to hike that particular trail.
Yeah, especially I feel like parks all the time get people who aren't there to hike. They're just here to visit the visitor center, see the beautiful views. So now for the people who are not venturing way out on these difficult things, they can learn about the park as well.
Exactly. I totally understand having it at the exact location of
course.
A big moment in that insurrection, but of course the insurrection happened throughout most of the island. So
yeah,
let's commemorate that as well. And speaking of other locations, there is an iconic sculpture titled Freedom, known commonly to Virgin Islander as the conch shell blower, created by Ghanaian sculptor Bright Bingpong. It was erected in 1998 in celebration of the 150th anniversary of the emancipation of enslaved people on the islands, and it was placed in Cruz Bay on St. John. So if you type in the conch shell blower, you'll see it. And in 2017, a copy of that sculpture, along with two others by the same sculptor, the same artist, were sent to Denmark, where they were given permanent public locations, including one in Copenhagen to remind the Danish public of their nation's colonial past, including their involvement and status as a quote-unquote slave nation. And the memorial served as the country's first official memorial of the slave era. So there's one on the island and a few in Denmark.
Very cool.
University of Maryland history professor Richard Bell, who has studied slavery extensively, said, quote, "All of us, from the general public to academic historians, can benefit from being presented with the incontrovertible evidence that enslaved people dreamed of freedom every day of their lives." Torre added, quote, "National park managers must be hyper-conscious about how they are sharing history. We need to be much more intentional about what we are doing and seek to break away from what has conventionally been taught and look to fill the gaps, because we are the keepers of American history and we are working in those places where history happened." So if the U.S. Virgin Islands and St. Thomas in particular are on your upcoming travel list, please consider a hike up to Ram's Head. The 2.3-mile out and back trail is considered moderately challenging and is rocky and steep in some areas, but it is a favorite amongst those who actually venture there. And now, as of March, you said, oh my God, 2 years ago? That's when it was just being presented as an idea. So as of March of 2024, a memorial plaque now sits at the summit of Ram's Head.
Wow,
it was
so 3 months ago.
3 months ago. It was unveiled. It was unveiled after a commemorative hike and ceremony led and attended by members of the Park Service, delegates to Congress, and the public. And it reads, "In memory of the brave St. Johnians enslaved ancestors who, in 1733, organized the first major battles of resistance against the brutality of the European slave trade in the Americas. On November 23rd, 1733, Akwamu nobles King Kanta, King Claes, King Juni, and the legendary Queen Brefu successfully led an organized armed conflict against their European enslavers. The Akwamu of the Gold Coast, today known as Ghana, West Africa, along with other enslaved individuals, fought and controlled the Danish colony of St. John for almost 6 months before collaborative European forces managed to regain control. In the area of Ramhead, a number of freedom fighters, rather than be returned to enslavement, ritualistically took their own lives in April of 1734. These events are significant to the history of St. John, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the United States. These events continue to inspire future generations to oppose the injustices of colonialism. And that is the story of the 1733 Akwamu Insurrection.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing it, because I knew nothing of this at all.
I
never heard this history.
No. And one of the bloodiest, most brutal uprisings. And it just served as kind of a launch point. Like I briefly mentioned, it inspired a lot of other uprisings throughout history. And
after such a successful uprising overall, I can see how that would inspire other people to be like, hey, we can't let this keep happening.
And we can do this. We're notable adversaries. We are not what our enslavers view us to be. And let's show them. So
let's fight back.
Yeah. So yeah, I thought, like I said, it is kind of hard to imagine all of that happening in a place that people vacation at and all of that.
Yeah, but now you go there to swim and lay on the beach and drink fruity drinks and
bird watch and whatever.
It's actually what happened here? Let me tell you.
Let me tell you.
It was horrific.
Yeah. So that's that. Hope everyone learned a little bit of something today. And if you are ever on the island, please take that hike if you're able and send us a picture. That would be really cool to see full circle, come around.
That would be cool.
Yeah, to see one of you up there. But yeah, so we will see you next time. In the meantime, enjoy the view.
But watch your back.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us again this week. If you have a trail tale or story suggestion, send us an email at stories@npadpodcast.com. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at National Park After Dark and on Twitter at NPAD Podcast. Join our Outsiders Only community on Patreon or Apple subscriptions to listen ad-free, unlock monthly bonus episodes, and exclusive content.
And remember, when you support our sponsors, you are supporting our show. For our exclusive discount codes and source information from today's episode, check out the show notes. For more information on our show, our book recommendations, merch updates, and more, visit our website at npadpodcast.com. And please rate, review, and subscribe from wherever you listen to podcasts.